Welcome to Literary AF Podcast.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. My name is Sheldon.
I'm Danny.
And we are here to talk to you guys about the dangers of beekeeping.
No,
now, the thing is, if you don't watch the bees, they could sting you.
No, that's the wrong one.
You're saying that bees will not sting you if you don't watch them?
I mean, bees are generally pretty harmless, but just don't go around trying to smack them is all.
Their butt is literally a spear.
But it's a one-time use spear.
Yeah, they're willing to kill themselves to minorly hurt you. That is dangerous in my books.
You gotta watch out for wasps. Those guys are assholes.
Okay, but what are we actually here to talk about today?
Actually here to talk about books. This is the Literary AF podcast.
Yes, as you might have heard from our intro, thank you, Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Daniel.
He's a real person. He's not a computer.
Not a robot.
Not something we pulled off online.
And...
totally legally. Oh, by the way, before we start, did
Yes.
you know that we have a rival podcast in town?
Oh.
Yeah.
What is that?
The Winnipeg Public Library has set up a book reading podcast called Time to Read, I think.
Oh.
And I haven't listened to it yet, but they are our rivals.
Alright, so we have to find them and fight them one by one. And then...
I saw the poster, and honestly, it won't be that hard.
Alright, cool. We can
They look very wimpy.
The Winnipeg Podcast Showdown.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, if you're a book-related podcast from the Winnipeg area, we want to fight you.
We will fight you.
All right. But no, today we are talking about a book that I just finished.
Yes.
It was a difficult read, and I'm sure some people have read it, and others probably have not.
Some people have read it.
I think for some people they had to read it at, like, university.
I could see that for sure. The
I
book,
never
by the
did.
way, is Don Quixote.
Yes.
By a guy whose name I don't know.
True. It's Miguel de Cervantes.
There you go.
I've mentioned it on some of the previous episodes as the book that I was currently reading.
Yes.
But now I'm currently finished,
Oh.
and we're going to talk about the book and see how that goes.
Yes. So why don't we just start with like a general plot summary? Because I know absolutely nothing about this book. I know that the main character's name is Don Quixote. That's about it.
All right. Well, you know everything. Okay. Well, here's the deal.
Mhm.
I didn't mean to start the review like that. I feel really weird. Can I take that back?
Mhm.
All right.
Yeah, all right. We'll rewind a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. So everyone, rewind your podcast to the 225 mark and forget what I just said.
Yep.
Oh wait, unless we do some editing, so it might not actually be at 225. We'll probably edit all of this out, and if not, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
All right. Well, anyway, Don Quixote is about a guy
Yes.
whose name is actually
Is it not actually his name?
no. That's what he changes his name to because it sounds more like a knight's name.
I see. All right.
His real name is like something Quijana, I think.
Okay.
Whatever. He's a semi-noble man living in a village.
Okay.
He's kind of rich, but not especially rich. He spends all of his time reading books. That's all he does. He reads books all day of chivalry. So that's like stories of knights.
Mm-hmm.
Like, kind of like the modern equivalent would be like superhero comics.
Okay, yeah.
Where it's like there are these ridiculous adventures, these larger-than-life characters. They're very like fantasy-based and not true. And all these stories of knights have like wizards and enchanters and giants, and the knights are always in love with the princess, and if they can stop the enchanter or kill the giant, then they can eventually be with the princess. Like, that's how all of these stories go down.
Right.
And Don Quixote has read so many of these stories that he becomes afflicted with a particular madness that makes him think that he's a knight from one of these stories.
So like when a guy is a comic book nerd and then he decides to dress up like Batman and then beat up bad guys.
It is kind of exactly the plot to the movie Kick-Ass.
Oh, okay.
Where he reads a lot of comics, then he thinks that he could do it too.
Alright, perfect.
Yeah.
Alright.
But it's very well done. So the book is, while it's a story about a guy who thinks he's a knight, it's also like a very, very good satire on the whole genre of like knights, like tales of chivalry and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he plays with a lot of the elements from those stories, and like he kind of mocks them while also like he's got such a like wide knowledge of them that I feel like he kind of like appreciates them too.
Mm-hmm.
So the story, so he decides to leave his village once on an adventure, and what he does is he just sits on his horse named Rochinante, I believe it's pronounced, and Rochinante is a very skinny and stubborn horse, and not at all fitting like the typical stallion you'd see in a...
Right, noble steed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's the very opposite of a noble steed.
Perfect.
And he decides that the best way to find adventure would be to just let Rochinante wander as he wants, and he'll stumble into adventure.
Excellent.
His first adventure is really short, and I believe he ends up at an inn that he mistakes for a castle, and there are several prostitutes there that he mistakes for maidens.
Ah, perfect.
And he tries to get them to... He tries to get the guy who owns the inn to make him, like, swear an oath, because that'll make him an official knight. But the guy running the inn is, like... he's, like, kind of sketchy, and he wants to, like, use Don Quixote, so he tries to, like, trick him into swearing to, like... It's not really important, and it doesn't really last too long, but that's the whole first adventure.
Okay.
And then after that, he gets back on his horse's back, and the horse, who is tired and just wants to go home, he just lets his horse wander, so his horse goes straight back home. So that's the end of the first adventure.
Perfect.
It lasts a whole day.
Yeah.
He decides for his second adventure... Oh, I should also mention that all knights have to be in love. So he randomly decides on this girl that he's going to be madly in love with.
Okay.
And despite having not seen this girl, he's heard that there's a woman in a nearby city who is fairly attractive. So he picks her as the one. But then he doesn't like her name, so he changes it to Dulcinea of Toboso.
All right.
And so he's in love with Dulcinea and will do anything for her, even though he's never seen her. And a lot of the book kind of revolves around her and around this idea of, like, he has to go meet her, but he doesn't know what she looks like, and nobody knows what she looks like because she's not real.
Right.
So, second adventure, he meets Sancho Panza, which is becomes a squire.
Okay.
And he's like a local farmer who is, he's not stupid, like but he kind of believes that this rich man is, like, not lying to him. So Don Quixote's like, oh, in all of these tales of knights, the squire is always made to be an emperor one day, or, you know, they become the governor of their own island. And that idea sticks in Sancho's head, and he thinks, well, I could become a governor, so I'm going with this guy. But he's not crazy and he's not stupid, so he sees through Don Quixote's, like, madness. But at the same time, he's like, I can't betray my master because I want this island. And the two of them together have, like, a lot of good chemistry, and they're really funny. They are the ones who have the main adventures. They go through. The second adventure is I think they also let the horses wander. I'm not too sure. They get beaten up a few times by random people, or they, like, get trampled by like herd of horses or stampedes. Like, they end up somehow in the mountains where Don Quixote decides that he has to deprive himself of food and water to prove to Dulcinea how much he loves her.
Perfect.
And he sends Sancho with a letter to Dulcinea, and Sancho's like, "Who's Dulcinea?" And then Don Quixote's like, "Oh, it's the daughter of such and such," and he's like, "Oh, wait, her? She's not a maiden. She's, like, basically a slut." And Don Quixote, like, loses it on Sancho, and, like, that's the first major rift between them.
Perfect.
Or no, there's probably more before that, but that is, like, one of the major moments.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Sancho goes to deliver this letter, but he forgets to take the letter from Don Quixote, so Don Quixote's still holding the letter when Sancho leaves.
All right.
So Sancho then makes it back to town. He tries to tell someone what he thought the letter said, but it's totally wrong. And then the priest and barber from their village are there, and Sancho runs into them, and they're like, "Where is Don Quixote," or whatever his real name is?
Right.
And then he's like, "Oh, he's starving himself in the wilderness so that his lover will know," or whatever. And they're like, "Hey, we have to save Don Quixote." So the first part of the story is it's the main gist of it is the priest, the barber, and then they meet a few other people along the way. They're trying to trick Don Quixote into going home, because they think if we can make him go back to his home and get him to stay there for a while, we can, like, erase this madness from his head.
Right.
So that's the whole plan. They're just trying to trick him to go back home, but he keeps, like, deceiving himself into other adventures. There's a lot of little side stories with the people they meet. Like, they'll do detailed backstories, and it's kind of episodic, the first story, or the first part. And then the second part, because it was originally two books that were now combined over time.
Right.
The second part was written like 15 years later, and I don't know exactly when it picks up. It might be picking up 15 years later, or it might be picking up like a year later or something.
Right.
But in the sequel, the story of Don Quixote has come out and is famous. It's kind of like how it was in real life. And everyone knows who this knight is, and they all know that he's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're treating him like he's an actual knight because they've all read the story.
Right.
So in the world of the sequel, the first book actually did come out, and it actually did kind of become famous. So then instead of them being like, who's this guy, he's crazy, just dismissing him, they're like, oh, this is that guy who's crazy. And then they try to like either fool him for their own amusement or something like that. It's a lot of like, they realize he's a madman and they're going to mess with him because they think that's going to be funny.
Right.
And then his whole third adventure is he goes out, he meets the Duke and Duchess. They're messing with him the whole time because they're fans of the book. There's also a sequel, an unofficial sequel written by a different author.
Okay.
And Miguel de Cervantes realizes this or gets word of this about halfway through the story, and you know exactly when in his writing process he finds out about the fake book, because then a major plot point becomes destroying copies of the fake Don Quixote and like constantly pointing out the ways that the fake Don Quixote sucks. And
Perfect.
yeah, so
Super meta.
it's a really meta book. It's surprisingly meta for something written in like the 1600s.
Okay.
Sancho gets his governorship, but it's like they're messing with him, and so they purposely make it way too hard for him, and like they're constantly like telling him like, oh, you can't eat anything because someone's trying to kill you, just because they know Sancho likes to eat food. And so they're like trying to starve him. And eventually though, this guy who's also from their village, who's a friend of Don Quixote's, he dresses up as a knight and he confronts Don Quixote and says, if I beat you in combat, you have to do whatever I say.
Right.
And then, so they do this once and Don Quixote beats him the first time, and then he shows up again a second time and beats Don Quixote the second time. And the second time the knight says, I want you to return to your village and you can go on no more adventures for a year. So basically ending Don Quixote's knight career.
Yeah.
And forcing him to go home and hopefully get better.
Right.
And this like totally crushes his spirit. He goes home, and the last 50 pages of the book are like sad because he's just like he has no life. He's super listless. He has no like sense of adventure. The like good old days are gone, and he gets sick and dies, and that's how the book ends. It's just like
a bummer.
It is kind of a bummer for a story that's like, it's very similar to. Do you remember that movie Nacho Libre?
Yes.
Where Jack Black thinks he's a luchador.
A luchador, yeah.
And he constantly gets beaten up because he's not really luchador.
Yes.
I think that's at least kind of based on Don Quixote, or at least it's very similar to Don Quixote.
Okay, I can see that.
And I'm like, just imagine if that movie ended with someone beating
Jack
him up
Black.
and telling him to go home, and then he dies.
Dies. That's awful.
Dies of sadness and sickness.
And it sounds like, aside from that, it's a really upbeat and like fun book. And those don't usually end with the main character getting sick and then dying sad.
But I feel like the author had to have the character die because he didn't want, like, because there's already been like one fake story written about Don Quixote, and I don't think he wanted it to turn into like just another night tale where it's like the same thing that he's kind of mocking. He doesn't want the book to become that, so if he kills the character, it's done.
The story's over when the character dies, so he may as well finish the story himself. Yeah.
And that's the general plot.
All right, that's a bit of a bummer. Who are your favorite characters?
Well, obviously, like Don Quixote and Sancho are the two that really carry it.
Yeah.
There's, also the horse though, and like Rocinante and Sancho's donkey, which he just calls the Gray because it's a gray donkey.
Perfect.
They're like weirdly portrayed, like the animals are friends with each other, and they like are exasperated by their masters who are constantly driving them into danger and stuff.
Yeah.
And every scene where they get hurt, where the people get hurt, the animals also get hurt, and it's just like, no, spare the poor donkey. Leave Rocinante alone.
I got a question though. Does he ever find his lady?
Never. Okay, well, sort of. He finds a random. So they go to the town where the lady's supposed to live, and he tells Sancho that he's not leaving until he finds the woman, and he makes a big deal out of it. And then Sancho plan is they're waiting along the side of the road when a random peasant girl's passing, and apparently she's like super ugly. And then Sancho runs up to her and is like, Dulcinea, you're here.
Perfect.
Our master, Don Quixote's waiting for you. And then Don Quixote's like, no, the woman I love is. And then he like, basically the image of what he's made up from like the stereotype from his books.
Yeah.
So he's like, oh, she's supposed to be a beautiful fair maiden. She's supposed to be like, her hair is supposed to be like some ridiculous metaphor, and like, you know, like he lists off all these things, and then Sancho's like, wait, but that's exactly what this woman looks like. Don't you see it? Oh no, you've been enchanted. So he tricks Don Quixote in thinking that he's been enchanted to not seeing his lady love.
Of course.
But then later, Sancho pays for this because the Duke and Duchess, who are like messing with them the whole time,
Yeah.
they have an actor riding in on like a fake horse, like dressed as a wizard.
Yeah.
And the wizard says the only way to cure the enchantment is for Sancho to whip himself on the butt
Ooh.
3,000 times.
That's rough.
So Sancho kind of pays for his lie there.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, it's but he never actually meets Dulcinea or any
Dulcinea.
version of Dulcinea.
What happens to Sancho at the end of the book?
Sancho and Don Quixote stay friends. Sancho tries to take care of him when he gets sick. And then I think he goes home, but he goes home kind of rich because Don Quixote leaves everything to Sancho, I believe.
Okay.
So,
Alright.
like, it's not like a totally sad ending.
Sancho gets a okay ending, I guess.
Yeah, and also Sancho kind of scams Don Quixote at one point because he's not giving himself the whips, and he's like, come on, you need to whip yourself. And then he's like, I'll even give you money if you whip yourself. And then Sancho's like, wait. wait. How much money are we talking? So they make this ridiculous deal, and then Sancho says that he needs to be alone in order to perform it. So then Don Quixote like stands away from him, and then Sancho starts whipping the trees beside him, and then screaming out in fake pain,
All right.
so that he gets the money and doesn't have to actually whip himself.
Perfect. All right. What's your least favorite moment / characters?
Least favorite? Okay, well, the first book has a lot of asides where it's like, you know, sometimes it's like, oh, here's this person that they've just met who's kind of joining up with them. And then it's like, here's their whole extended backstory. And it'll be like, oh, this whole adventure story that's totally disconnected from any of the characters. And they're well written and they're kind of good, but it's just like, it's such an aside from the story that it's like, I just skimmed through them really quick because
Right.
I felt like I didn't need to read them.
It's also a very long book.
It is really long. It's about 1,000. It's just under 1,000 pages, I think.
That's
The version I had was 960. But my least favorite characters are actually the Duke and Duchess
okay.
because the whole, like, the first book is so, like, here's all these people who want to help a mentally ill person get home, and they'll use trickery if they have to. They'll play along with his games if they have to, but ultimately they kind of want to help him.
Yeah.
Whereas the Duke and Duchess are honestly like, okay, we're rich and bored, and here's somebody we can have fun with, so we're going to mess around.
Of course.
And, I forgot to mention, one of the Duchess's handmaidens falls in love with Don Quixote, and she goes kind of, not crazy, but she, like... And actually, I don't even know if she's really in love with him or if, like, the Duchess just put her up to it because she thought it'd be funny.
Yeah.
But, Altisidora is really a super funny character, and but she keeps getting so mad because Don Quixote keeps rejecting her in favor of his imaginary girlfriend,
Right.
and she I kind of wish they did more with her because she's a fun character, but the fact that she didn't come to anything is kind of disappointing.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Are we gonna do favorite part?
Yes. What's your
Okay.
favorite part of the book?
Okay, so
I
I've
thought I had
mentioned.
asked that one already, but I did not.
No, I mentioned on a previous one the whole part with him thinking he could fight 20 men at once because he's
Yes.
as strong as 100, and then getting his ass thoroughly kicked.
Yeah.
That part is very good, but I think my actual favorite part is at one point they're in an inn, and I think it might be actually right after he was beaten up by the horse tamers.
Okay.
So immediately following the first event,
Getting
they go to
pounded,
an
yeah.
inn and he's resting because he's very sore,
Right.
thoroughly beaten. And he's in a dark room, and it's like the inn, the way it's set up is it's like I think everyone's sleeping in the loft, and there's like multiple beds up there. Like there's maybe like 6 beds in this one big room.
Right.
And then it's very dark up there. And so I don't remember the exact order of events, but I'm going to do it as best I can. So if there's anyone who's like a major Don Quixote file out there who's listening to this and is like, you messed up the order of what happened, chill, okay? It's been like 3 or 4 weeks since I read that passage because it's in the first part of the book.
Yeah.
But what happens is they're in the upstairs. Don Quixote's like asleep and resting. Sancho comes up to his bed, but then I think when he comes up, he wakes Don Quixote, and Don Quixote is like, he mistakes Sancho for somebody else, and it kind of starts no, not yet. Sorry, that's later. First of all, it's the maid of the inn. So she's the daughter of the innkeeper. She comes upstairs because her secret lover is upstairs. But when she comes upstairs, Don Quixote, thinking that because he's a knight, he's irresistible to women, thinks that she's come up to see him. So before she can get past him, he like grabs a hold of her in a hug and is like telling her that he can't be with her because he needs to be with Dulcinea. And she's like fighting back and she won't say anything because she doesn't want her dad to know that she's up there, doesn't want her to hear his voice. So she's like fighting against him. And then her lover like hears the noise and then he tries to help her, but then he ends up like getting tangled up with Sancho because it's so dark up there.
Right.
So then he starts beating the crap out of Sancho. So there's like this, and then other people from the inn are like coming upstairs and then getting like brought into this brawl.
Right.
And it's so dark that they can't see what's happening. And like, Don Quixote is convinced that because they were able to beat him up, and he's a knight, so that makes him the strongest warrior ever.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're able to beat him up, that means that there's like a magical enchantment, and they weren't really people, they were ghosts.
Oh.
And so he's like convinced that he got beat up by ghosts in this inn, and like the police or whatever, it's like the Holy Brotherhood, I think, is what they had for police back then. They showed up, and then somehow they got dragged into the fight too, because Don Quixote thought it was like another spirit coming to join the fray, and like it's just like such a silly mix-up, but it's like ends up in this giant brawl. And then when they try to leave the inn, Don Quixote refuses to pay because of he's like, why would I pay like to get terrorized by spirits all night? And then so they leave, but then Sancho forgets something and Sancho has to go back. So then the innkeeper's like, well, if you're not going to pay and your master's not going to pay, we're just going to beat the crap out of you. So they grab Sancho, they throw him in a blanket, and then they like toss him up into the air. And then Sancho is so ashamed of this for the rest of the book that he like keeps of leaving this detail out whenever he tells other people the story of their adventures so far. But like just by like sheer chance or whatever, everyone always finds out what happens to Sancho. And so it's just funny, like they have this ridiculous situation where nobody understands what's going on. Sancho like mildly believes what the master is saying, but is also like, I'm pretty sure we just got beaten up by regular people. Don Quixote is convinced it's an enchanted Moor, I think is what he says at the end. But it's just it's a fun little mix-up.
Ghosts.
Yeah.
Ghosts. Would you recommend this book to somebody else?
Yes. It's very good, and it's so meta. And it's the version I found was the translation was by Edith Grossman because it's originally written in Spanish, and I'm guessing it's like, you know how English has Old English?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm guessing this was like Old Spanish or whatever.
Okay.
Ye Old Spanish. But the language by Edith Grossman, it feels really natural and not like old-timey, like it's not like parsing through Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And also she does a really good job of like the footnotes of making note of like, oh, this is a reference to this, or like this is wordplay that doesn't really translate to English. Here's what it's supposed to mean.
Right.
And she does a really good job of that kind of stuff to really point out like the meta humor of the book. There's a lot of satire that even though you might not have read like Tales of Chivalry or whatever, the footnotes do a really good job of explaining what it is, and also like if you keep in mind that it's kind of like comic book heroes now, it kind of works. And ultimately, I mean, it's a really fun read. I think it is really long, and the first part is a little episodic. The second part, it's a little boring in places because not a lot happens. But I think maybe this one might be a good one to find a bridge copy of, if you ever could. But I deeply enjoyed it. Like, I thought it was really funny. And yeah, and I like the characters by the end. Like, the last 50 pages were kind of a bummer because I liked them and I wanted to see like some form of happiness
Happy
come to
ending.
these people.
Yeah, of course. You know, I never really thought about that. Like, books from foreign languages are going to be different depending on who translates them. So,
Yeah.
different versions are going to kind of play out differently. That makes sense, I guess.
I think especially that applies when it's humor because like
Yes.
comedy is so tough to like nail the timing of and the wording of and
Yeah.
stuff. And so like if you had a bad translator or like someone who's translating it like word for word, a lot of the jokes wouldn't.
It just flies right by, yeah.
Yeah.
It totally makes sense. How are we doing for...
We're at 25 minutes, so we
Oh,
have
we're getting
a
there.
couple more minutes to chat.
Would this replace any of your island books?
You know, maybe because it's really long
Keep you busy?
and because it's got those episodic stories that it's
Mhm.
kind of like you have like multiple stories in one.
Yeah.
And honestly, like if I had more time to read, I think I would reread this at some point.
Right.
Right now, it's like I have a list like a mile long of books that I want to read.
Of
but,
course, yeah.
I wouldn't say it's like a new favorite of mine, but it's pretty close.
It's good. It's
Yeah.
up there, yeah. Alright. Well, that's good.
Yeah. So what have you been reading these days?
I am still working on the Immortals After Dark series.
Oh, and we can't say too much about that
No.
until a future episode.
Yeah, coming up. Aside from that, not much has changed since last time.
Oh yeah.
A lot of serialized stuff, so just the next volume in
The next volume
yeah.
of yeah.
I haven't started anything totally new yet.
For sure.
What are you starting next?
Right now I started reading. Oh, I gotta quickly Google the author's name, so it seems like I know it. Definitely not gonna edit this part out. I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah, it's a little peek behind the curtain.
No, I knew the name of the book. It's definitely the name of the book is In Different Stars Above.
Oh, okay, yeah, the Donner Party book.
Yes, it's by Daniel James Brown.
That's it.
I knew that for sure. I didn't have to look it up quickly on my computer. It's a the story of the Donner Party. Last podcast on the left did a very excellent couple episodes on the Donner Party.
It was really good.
Story about the pilgrims who are traveling to California, who left a little too late and got stranded in the mountains during the winter.
Yeah.
And it turns to cannibalism. I'm not that far into the story yet. I'm about 100 pages into it, and it's only a 300-page book.
Yeah, it's not a super huge book.
But it's a very interesting story, and the way the guy tells it well. He basically like took a lot of historical sources and like journals and diaries and stuff, but he still like kind of writes it as a narrative where it's like, here's the story of a woman and her husband who are leaving to go travel to this place, and they just happen to be part of this Donner Party.
Right.
But then also there'll be a lot of like chunks of like, oh, in fact, Mary Brown, blah blah blah, said this in her diary, and then it'll be like an actual excerpt from her diary.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
And my one kind of problem with it is because it's a historical book, and it's like it's nonfiction, but it's still a narrative.
Yeah.
But they have a lot of like various threads of like, well, here's what's going on here for some context, or here's what's happening in California for some context.
Right.
And a lot of those side stories I feel are kind of unnecessary, where it's like, I'm interested in what's happening to this woman and her husband and these pilgrims on the road.
Right.
I don't really care what's going on with the governor of California at that moment. California. I said California, and that is not... yeah, I did not mean to do that.
I was expecting it to be more like, I guess, factual, not written like a narrative, just kind of laying out all the contents of diaries and stuff like that. So it's kind of cool to see that it's written as a narrative, because I did buy a copy of that when it was on sale on Kindle. I just haven't had a chance to crack it open.
Yeah, well, if you read that, we could maybe do an episode where we have both read it.
Yeah, we could do that. Talk about the Donner Party.
But yeah, that's I think that's mostly it.
Yeah.
Should we do some shoutouts?
Shoutouts to our Twitter account.
Oh yeah, not to other people, to us.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out who we would be shouting out to, but
big shout out to my boy the Moon. Yes. There was a super blood moon the other day. Really good work.
A blood wolf moon. Super blood wolf moon.
That's one too far. Take it back. Forget the moon.
Take
the moon
back
is back
the moon,
in our
shout out.
book of enemies.
How about the sun though? He's a bro. No.
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 Actually, nature in general is on the
Oh.
no list.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, shout out to the internet. You're great.
All right, I can buy that one.
Yeah.
What's our Twitter?
Our Twitter is LiteraryAFPod. Our Gmail is also LiteraryAFPod at gmail.com.
So follow us on Gmail. Send us some emails on Twitter.
DMs on Twitter, but emails are good.
Actually, do not DM us on Twitter.
My DMs are open.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, and tune back in next week when we talk about book.
More books. Other books.